In this session, we turn to examine some of the tensions between the coalition partners. Our first presenter is Professor Tom Frame, who will talk about the National Firearms Agreement of 1996, one of the first great policy tests of the coalition. Professor Frame has had a long and distinguished career, first as an officer in the Royal Australian Navy, after which his postgraduate studies led to degrees in both military history, his PhD, and theology, a Masters of Theology. From 2001 to 2006, he was Anglican Bishop to the Australian Defence Force and subsequently became Director of St Mark's National Theological Centre in Canberra. In 2014, Professor Frame was appointed Director of the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict and Society at UNSW Canberra. And in 2017, he was appointed inaugural Director of the Howard Library, my predecessor. He's authored or edited more than 50 books. The most relevant to this presentation is Gun Control, What Australia Got Right and Wrong, published in 2019. Tom is a good friend and colleague, and I might say a firearms enthusiast. Tom, the screen is yours.
Thank you, David. Mr. Howard, colleagues and critics, ladies and gentlemen. Can I first offer my greetings from Tarago, which I'm sure you all know is near Goulburn in New South Wales, and I'm speaking to you from a converted office in the front of my shearing shed. I'm actually a cattle farmer, but I have a shearing shed, and there's perhaps no better place to talk about the coalition and the National Party from a shearing shed. I'm not out the back of the shearing shed, it's a little bit dark, but in the office in the front. And I must say that I find it extraordinary that 25 years have now passed since the Howard government was elected. At that time, I was living in a small place called Binder, which is between Goulburn and Bathurst. It was an electorate held by John Sharp, and he went on to win the 1996 election, that seat, as the member for Hume, as a National Party candidate. And as I think across the span of the four Liberal national governments that were led by John Howard, Tim Fischer, John Anderson and Mark Vaile, of a short list of their achievements, I think maintaining a healthy coalition and negotiating the National Firearms Agreement, widely known, are invariably mentioned. And yet one could have prevented the other and lead easily to policy failure and political disaster. So in this presentation, I want to argue that the government's response to the 1996 Port Arthur massacre shaped the tenor of relationships between senior Liberal and National leaders and set the tone for coalition arrangements for the ensuing 11 years, 8 months and 23 days of the Howard era. I also need to say that the National Firearms Agreement was also accompanied, I think, by some policy failings and political fallout that I will mention at the close of my presentation because I believe their legacies remain, now 25 years on. Well, first some background. Now, the possibility that there might be a random shooting spree in a public place was feared by many but predicted by few when a lone gunman killed 35 people and injured another 23 at Port Arthur in Tasmania on the afternoon of Sunday, the 28th of April, 1996. There had been, of course, the Hoddle Street and Queen Street shooting sprees in 1987, just 4 months apart, and another at Strathfield Plaza in Sydney in 1991. But the passage of time and the absence of another such incident had slowly diminished the urgency for firearm law reform in the political sphere. Now, it is a matter of record that Bob Hawke was more committed than was his successor Paul Keating to changing the law, but neither managed to overcome opposition in the states, which had responsibility for firearm legislation. The Commonwealth's only role in this area being the importation of both firearms and ammunition. And so during the 1996 election campaign, it is now quite extraordinary that no one asked the opposition leader, John Howard, not even once, whether he was considering firearm law reform, given it was a matter of interest to the incumbent Labor government. Well, it simply wasn't an issue attracting any public profile, although both Howard and the Nationals leader Tim Fischer had both mentioned the prospect of restrictions during the previous year, that is 1995, and had quietly pledged to reduce the number and the availability of firearms in the community. But there was, however, no pressure on the coalition parties to address existing arrangements on being elected to office this day 25 years ago. Farmers, recreational hunters and sporting shooters who were rusted on national supporters presumed talk of restricting ownership and limiting access to firearms was little more than political rhetoric, a pitch to urban and suburban voters. But the comments of Howard and Fischer on firearm law should have precluded any thinking coalition voter that the government on election might ease the import restrictions on previously restricted classes of firearm. Now, although Howard had lobbied vigorously for a bipartisan approach when he was opposition leader in 1987 to the reform of firearm laws after those two closely related shooting sprees in public places in Melbourne, he was rebuffed by Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his Attorney General Lionel Bowen, and actually felt more strongly about the issues than either his colleagues realised or the public knew. It didn't matter much because throughout a highly disciplined election campaign, Howard and Fischer focused on the failings of the Keating government and presented the coalition as a credible alternative administration, and that he did or didn't have views about firearm law reform made no difference to people's voting behaviour. As we know, 25 years ago, the public were persuaded that the coalition was a credible alternative administration and the government changed. But just 7 weeks later, and within 24 hours of the Port Arthur massacre, the coalition government was well on its way to insisting that the 6 state and 2 territory governments accept a national agreement that required the licensing of firearm owners, the registration of individual firearms, the imposition of new restrictions on the ownership of certain rifles, shotguns and handguns, and the compulsory surrender and supervised destruction of firearms that shooters were no longer allowed to own. This would have been and was utterly inconceivable 12 months earlier. The agreement had 3 closely related objectives. The first was obviously preventing another random shooting spree in a public place. The second was asserting the national government's authority to insist on uniform firearm laws. And the third objective was preventing what John Howard called the American disease from further infecting the Australian people. Throughout the 1990s, shooting sprees in public places in the United States became more frequent, and that continued in the 2 decades after the 1990s. Now, Tim Fischer's judgment in wholeheartedly supporting the NFA's principles was openly questioned by his parliamentary colleagues Ian Sinclair, Bob Catter and Deanne Kelly, with the federal director of the National Party complaining that the agreement had been sold, and I quote, appallingly badly to our constituency. Indeed, the Queensland Police Minister and former Premier, Russell Cooper, complained that the Prime Minister was, and here I quote again, enjoying a position of all care and no responsibility, and was lauded as the moral champion in the push for national uniformity. But Cooper said he does not have to deal with any of the practical, administrative and financial problems associated with those laws. But as the leader of the party that appeared to have most to lose by supporting a new regulatory regime that was bound to anger farmers, hunters and shooters, whom John Howard acknowledged had done nothing wrong, Fischer and the Nationals had 3 options: comply, contest or compromise. And in different ways, I want to argue that they did all 3 at different points of time and in different ways. First, let me say something about the National Party's compliance. Now, with his Nationals Cabinet colleagues John Sharp and John Anderson, Fisher agreed that the existing state legislative regimes were entirely inconsistent and inadequately enforced. It almost didn't take any argument, it was almost a given. A national approach on something like firearms made sense, and the Nationals agreed that national leadership was needed. So having decided to support the Prime Minister, the Nationals' federal ministers went to work on their state counterparts to ensure their support. Now, this didn't mean they were indifferent to the place and function of the states, although Fisher threatened to seek a constitutional amendment to give the Commonwealth the necessary power to legislate were the states to refuse. Such was the depth of his commitment to this reform. The coalition was therefore, by its existence, important in reshaping the contours of Commonwealth-state relations, helped by the government having the second largest parliamentary majority in Australian electoral history, and the Liberals acting in concert with the Nationals, although they could have proceeded alone, as we have heard. Now, I would say it is unlikely that a Labor government could have succeeded in securing the agreement of all states and territories to a national firearms agreement in 1996, given the initial resistance of the Tasmanian and Queensland state governments. Without the coalition, I think there would have been no NFA. So the two parties agreed in principle, but what are the practicalities where the devil normally lurks? Well, the details of the NFA were contested. So there was compliance with the principle, but contesting the practical matters. Now, there's no doubt the model legislation that had been drafted by the Labor Justice Minister, Senator Michael Tate, after the Strathfield Plaza massacre in 1991, which was essentially taken off the shelf to be championed by John Howard after the Port Arthur massacre, was far more restrictive than many in the National Party felt was justified in the circumstances, tragic as they were. So there followed intense negotiations about the agreement's details, and important exemptions were granted to primary producers with respect to semi-automatic rimfire rifles and pump-action and self-loading shotguns. Now, without the political influence of the National Party's parliamentarians, some of whom wanted to resist blanket prohibitions and even more draconian restrictions, I do think it important that the practical needs of farmers, and less so the vocational needs of hunters and shooters, would not have been considered, and all current Category C firearms would have been banned. I'm really confident in that view of what would have happened without the Nationals and their party room and its influence on the combined party room. And so the discussions that went on within both party rooms and when they joined together in May and June of 1996 was actually thoughtful and constructive, unlike the emotional hysteria and special pleading that was promoted by a range of community groups, some demanding more restrictions, others insisting on fewer. It was a very polarised debate, and I think the National Party, in concert with the Liberal Party, managed that well to give us an outcome that met the need and the expectations of the Australian people. Now, the drafting and delivery of the National Firearms Agreement, of course, as mostly happens with complex policy matters, involved a compromise that reflected the national mood and the public expectation that the national government would indeed show national leadership. Now, although it may have looked like Nationals failed to defend the interests of their stakeholders, most farmers accepted the need for a tighter regulatory regime, and few reported that they could no longer pursue their vocation as farmers or, in respect of hunters and shooters, their recreation as a consequence of the reforms. Yes, if they had been allowed, they would have liked to have had an AR-15, but you don't need it in farming, you wouldn't use it in hunting, and recreational shooting is far better off using a bolt-action centerfire rifle rather than an AR-15. That's my view as a farmer and someone who also engages in sport shooting. Now, the agreement, therefore, did not prevent farming, it didn't prohibit hunting, and it didn't end sport shooting. Now, there certainly was a lot more paperwork associated with firearm ownership, and there were more regulations involved with firearms use. But most firearm owners, and I think this needs to be said, and as many users of firearms accepted the additional burdens and constraints while hoping the passage of time would allow the restrictions to be eased. Now, that hasn't happened, but I think people thought that once the emotion of Port Arthur had moved on, then reform would be possible. Now, some of the physical compromises that were implicit in the NFA, in my view, made no sense. And these became the principal source of cynicism and complaint and probably made their way into political dissent. For instance, private individuals could legally own a semi-automatic pistol up to 44 calibre, which could easily be concealed, but they could not own a smaller calibre semi-automatic centerfire rifle, which was more difficult to conceal. So I could have my 9mm Glock in my pocket, and that was not prohibited, although I could only use it at a shooting range, but I couldn't have an AR-15, which would take a very large sports bag or something even larger if I wanted to take it to a public place. Nevertheless, I think it is unlikely that either a Labor or Liberal government acting alone could have delivered the National Firearms Agreement without seriously impeding farming, hunting and sports shooting, which are big vocations and pastimes in Australia. Now, having negotiated the agreement, and I think shown considerable internal consensus to both the Parliament and the press, senior Liberals and Nationals, I think, were then confident as a consequence of what they were able to achieve with the NFA, that they could work effectively in coalition and that both parties could secure reasonable concessions from the other. Now, there is reason to believe that primary producers in particular were the beneficiaries of government goodwill over the ensuing 4 years, because the National Party had decided to work with the Liberal Party on firearms legislative reform, despite, can I say, the misgivings of economic ministers who remained committed to budget repair and repaying government debt, and who thought perhaps Canberra was being too generous with those on the land. But from the NFA, there was a view that, well, there was an acceptable way of doing business, and that was that each party recognised and respected the needs and imperatives of the other, and acknowledged that needs and imperatives were genuine, rather than just pork barrelling or special pleading. And that was based, I think, on the quality of the relationships that existed between members of Cabinet who were committed to shared national goals. They were helped in this respect, of course, by protracted economic growth and, after 2001, to much more favourable commodity prices. But the point I would make here is that this is an aspect of government that rarely receives the attention it significantly deserves. In the Howard government's cabinet ministers, for the greatest part, got on with each other well and maintained very healthy personal relationships with candour and conviction. Now, there is, of course, ample evidence of what a factionalised party room and a divided cabinet means for the administration of the nation's affairs. Party room conflict can bring public administration to a grinding halt. And I wonder whether or not it's because the coalition agreement worked so well between 1996 and 2007 that there was close adherence to the principles of cabinet solidarity until around 2005, when I think there was less of that, and that these dividends were simply presumed. But constructive and productive working relationships we would gain from an examination of the Howard years need to be nurtured and sustained for effective government across multiple terms of office, noting the tendency of the Australian people to give each major party at least 2 terms in office. So working together across 5 to 6 years is something that has to be tended and nurtured. Now, although the Howard cabinets contain some big personalities on the Liberal side, and the names Costello, Downer, Reith, Alston and Minchin come readily to mind, they all worked harmoniously with the National Party to present a united front. And I think the electorate appreciated not just the unity, but the solidarity of the coalition team, and it was a value add that those leading both the Liberals and the Nationals were keen to see continue. Now, in the matter of firearm law reform, whether the National Party was too willing to oblige its larger coalition partner, and whether the Liberal Party took its junior coalition partner to be too much for granted, is a question that continues to arouse emotion. It continues to, particularly in the shooting community. Those commentators who thought the government had responded adequately to the Port Arthur massacre, of course, commended both coalition parties and noted the work done by Tim Fischer to restrain dissenting elements on the Nationals' backbench. But those who thought the government overreacted by imposing a regulatory regime that did not address the principal causes of the tragedy at Port Arthur denounced the National Party and its sellout, to the extent that an effigy of Fischer, donned with an Akubra hat, was hung from the branch of a tree outside a pro-gun meeting, and of all places, Gympie. I suppose that's where it's most likely to happen. Now, despite receiving death threats and being concerned for the welfare of his wife and children, Tim decided that because uniform national laws were important to all public safety, compromise was completely out of the question, even if it would burn parts of his own party. He would not, he said, be a populist on the margins. He would accept the political fallout. He would take responsibility for it in embracing a different view of firearm regulation than that held by those of the National Party in the 1970s and the 1980s. But I have to make the point that the political fallout was, however, felt entirely by the National Party and principally at the state level. On the 25th of May in 1996, so as the NFA was being negotiated, 5 by-elections were held in New South Wales, where the Carr government had been in power since defeating the Fay coalition government the previous year. 3 of the by-elections were prompted either by state members seeking election to federal parliament or the resignation of sitting members. The seat of Clarence, formerly held by the National Party, was lost with a swing of nearly 14% to Labor's Harry Woods. The other 4 seats, 3 Liberal and 1 National, were retained by the coalition, although notably the National Party suffered a major swing against it of again 14% in the seat of Orange. The result suggested the NFA had no effect on the Liberal vote, but had put a substantial dent in the Nationals' vote. And this was certainly the view of the New South Wales state leader and former Deputy Premier, Ian Armstrong. Opposition to the NFA also morphed into support for the energised Shooters Party in New South Wales, and federally there is evidence of National Party vote drifting to the newly formed One Nation as a consequence of the NFA, although I would argue, and I believe Murray Goot would support me in the view, that most of One Nation's appeal lay elsewhere. Now, although I was a libertarian and firearm owner, I maintain philosophical and practical objections to the NFA, and I have to say that. I recognised then, and I believe now, that the pre-1996 arrangements were inadequate and that a national agreement of the kind implemented post-1996 was necessary, and it was overdue, and it has brought great benefits to our country. And so I would contend in closing that despite the most conducive conditions for reform existing after the Port Arthur massacre, it was actually the existence and operation of an effective coalition between the Liberal and National parties that provided the platform for the implementation of a national agreement for which, in my view, John Howard and the late Tim Fischer, with help from my friend John Anderson, deserve enduring credit. Let me stop at that point, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for both that analysis and for the frankness with which you put your views. Yes, we have a few minutes for questions, and there is a question that I'd like to ask you, which is about how subsequent coalition governments have handled the issue of firearms control.
Look, David, that's a very tricky one because the National Firearms Agreement really only affects people who are shooters, and those people are not a major political constituency in Australia, and they don't tend to vote as a bloc other than those that choose to vote for shooters parties or perhaps a very small number for One Nation. That being so, I think that most of Australia thinks the National Firearms Agreement has actually brought more practical benefits to the country than it has. Now, Mr. Howard and I will disagree on the extent of those benefits, and he knows my views and I know his. And I do think it was necessary, but I think the difficulty is that people have come to believe that if we change anything in the NFA, that there will be a massacre in a public place next week, that the public won't be as safe. And none of the evidence suggests that that is true, that a number of the elements of the agreement, it seems to me, are just administratively ineffective and expensive, and that if we wanted to keep the people safe, we could water down some of the administration, move the money into an area which I believe is of greater urgency, which is the continuing scourge of domestic violence in homes, and actually make more people more safe by that means than just by saying, oh, we won't touch the National Firearms Agreement, which after 25 years essentially is largely unchanged, although the states have got different attitudes towards fully implementing it.
But Tom, do you believe that nationals are under pressure from their constituents to try to change this or to try to renegotiate the agreement? Is there any of that going on? I note in particular Fishers, Shooters and Farmers Party in New South Wales, which looks at various points to be quite a threat to the nationals in the countryside.
If I can take the last part first, because it's a good point, that it seems to me the National Party has reduced the temptation to head towards the right in order to, if you like, gobble up or retake the constituency of One Nation and the Shooters. I mean, the Shooters Party is well to the right of anyone, and it seemed to me that the National Party might have been tempted to head in that direction with other policy positions unrelated to firearms for the purpose of stealing the air from those political parties. I think my view is that, and you see this even at the late 90s, the National Farmers Federation is saying there's scope to amend these laws to make them more effective in the areas where it'll matter and to lighten up on some of the restrictions in others, just the paperwork. So it's always been there. Is it major pressure? No, because it's not a vote changer. In writing a book about gun control, I spoke to many groups, many of whom thought I was either in allegiance with the devil being those that want change or those that don't. But it doesn't actually, in my view, from what I can see, change people's votes, because they vote for Shooters, Farmers and Fishers, or previously just Shooters, for upper house positions. It's only in Orange and a few places like that where it's, since becoming Shooters, Farmers and Fishers, has their appeal broadened. But I wouldn't have said that the National Party now was under pressure on firearms legislation. I just think as a matter of public policy, it deserves to be renegotiated, as does the GST, the other bit of enduring Howard Government legislation that's largely untouched. Circumstances change, and I think policy should be reviewed, or at least examined to see whether it still fulfilled its objectives.
Well, that's an interesting thought, but let me not go down that rabbit hole, but to come back to an issue which is quite important in the firearms agreement, that is the extraordinary cooperation between state and Commonwealth government, which led to the agreement, because for the constitutional reasons you hinted at. Has that cooperative spirit that we saw very quickly after the Port Arthur massacre, has that cooperative spirit between state and Commonwealth persisted through the Howard government or through years beyond?
Yeah, when it comes to firearms specifically, the states and the Commonwealth have continued to talk, and that is good. And some of them said, look, we want to head in these directions for these reasons. And the Commonwealth has not objected, either Labor or Liberal, as the national government. But in terms of, did we see people energised to make Commonwealth-state relations more productive and harmonious as a consequence of the NFA, I think we'd have to say no. They still squabbled over all other areas of public administration and public policy. And I suppose, David, we're confronted with this again. There was a great deal of unanimity with respect to COVID and the National Cabinet. Whether that lasts and whether a new spirit of magnanimity results, I think we're yet to see that. I still think we vote differently in the states and in the Commonwealth, and I think that's politicians at both levels are attuned to that.
Well, thank you again, Tom. Perhaps on a note of hope, we can end the session there. Delegates, can I remind you that we have a lunch break, a virtual lunch break. I intend to have a virtual sandwich for the next half an hour, and we recommence the conference at 1 p.m. sharp. Tom, thanks very much for your contribution, and I'll see you shortly.